Greetings, my name is Becky Ross, and I'm a professor in sociology and the GRSJ Institute at UBC. It is my honor and privilege to contribute to a model on sex work under COVID for this COVID-19 and society course. I acknowledge that I'm working and living as a white settler on the ancestral, unceded, and stolen territories of the Coast Salish peoples, Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. I am a white, queer, feminist socialist and a longtime social justice activist and ally. I'll begin by sharing two introductory slides to the COVID-19 and society course and to my contribution sex work under COVID-19 with a focus on stigmatization, criminalization, and resistance by organizers. So here is my outline and objectives for my module, part 1, part 2, and part 3. And I'll begin with part 1. What sex work is and why it matters. For more than a century in Canada, the industry of sex work has been shrouded in secrecy, shaped by moral panics, and pilloried as a menace to the family, private property, and the white settler colonial state. No official party in Canada has lobbied for sex workers' rights as human rights. No Ministry of Education has integrated sex work and sex work literacy into high school curricula. No labor union has made a priority of organizing with and for sex workers to improve working conditions, including pay, workplace security and safety, and access to basic labor rights. Here it's important to note that union bosses have not made efforts to support collective bargaining among sex workers. No mainstream media outlet has consistently integrated stories told by sex workers from their own standpoint about their complex relationships to sexual commerce. No police force or RCMP detachment has made a priority of sustained collaboration with sex work communities who have been over-policed and under-protected. This is a similar time of reckoning for law enforcement in the United States as protesters have called out anti-Blackness and police brutality, most recently in response to the murder of African-American George Floyd by a white police officer in Minneapolis. Finally, no government income support system or program in Canada has targeted sex workers as eligible or worthy recipients of state aid in spite of their dramatic loss of income due to important health directives during the COVID-19 pandemic. So, multiple sites of institutional repudiation of sex workers have contributed to their marginal status for centuries in Canada and elsewhere. So, considering complexity and diversity, what can we learn about social and economic inequalities through the lens of sex workers' experiences, both past and present? How do key terms such as sex work, stratification, criminalization, stigmatization, and agency help us grasp complex and diverse facets of the sex industry under COVID-19? Let's start with some foundational concepts. Sex work is the exchange of money for sexual services provided by a consenting adult. It includes phone sex, pornography, online webcamming, erotic massage, escorting, street-based work, exotic dancing or stripping, burlesque, professional domination and submission, and sugar baby, sugar daddy arrangements. Individuals under 18 in Canada cannot legally consent to engage in sex work. Human trafficking or sex trafficking involves individuals who have been forced or coerced into providing sexual services, or more commonly other forms of labor for little or no pay. By contrast, sex work involves individuals who consent to an exchange of sexual services for money. So that's a very important distinction. Some sex workers work part-time, others work full-time. Some street-based sex workers charge $20 for a blowjob. Some high-end escorts charge clients $500 per hour. White, blonde, large-breasted cis women have been the most successful in the sex business. Some individuals can be forced by circumstances to engage in sex work as a last resort to meet their daily survival needs. They may be living with poverty and drug use issues. Sex workers who choose to work in the industry point to the flexibility in terms of hours and rates and customers, as well as vulnerability to police harassment and arrests, economic downturns, and now the pandemic. Thirdly, sex workers are women, men, trans, and non-binary. They are independent contractors, much like hairstylists, massage therapists, graphic designers, and tattoo artists. And I have learned over the decades that professional sex workers sell their time, skill, and emotional labor. They do not sell their bodies. On the theme of sex work positive memes, some days you just need a hug on the butt with a paddle. And since hugging is now prohibited, this seems like a reasonable replacement. Were we to add masks, gloves, and sanitizer, the paddling practice could work well in COVID. Another sex-positive meme. Today I learned that the average person has 8 different sexual partners in their lifetime. Today I also learned that I'm a whore. I love this meme because it destigmatizes promiscuity and is evidence of what Korean American comedian Margaret Cho calls slut pride, as opposed to slut shame. Key terms continued. Sex work is a stratified industry. It's conducted in many contexts and is experienced differently based on one's class, race, age, sexuality, gender, age, geography, and citizenship status. There are millions of sex workers globally. Sex work has ranged in location from temples in ancient Greece to modern-day brothels in Wellington, New Zealand, to massage parlors and strip clubs in downtown Vancouver. In Canada, sexual services are cis, trans, and non-binary. Cis and trans women are overrepresented as sellers. A small percentage of cis and trans men sell sex, and men from truck drivers to judges constitute the vast majority of buyers of sexual services. So this gender symmetry is part of patriarchal social organization of sex work and society more broadly. Thirdly, in Canada, over 85% of sexual commerce is conducted by adults indoors, with only 10 to 15% street-based or outdoors. Certainly the most visible work is outdoors, but this forms less than 15% of the industry. And certainly the trade has been moving indoors for the past 50 years to hotels, private homes, commercial venues such as massage parlors, and online forums. Today, the menu of activities sold is very diverse. Sex work is criminalized in Canada. Federal anti-prostitution legislation, Bill C-36, in place since 2014, is an end-demand model that prohibits the purchasing of sexual services and effectively criminalizes prostitution. Other offenses include communicating to sell sexual services in public places near schoolyards, playgrounds, or daycares, and advertising the sale of sexual services. So the law aims to target buyers. However, sex workers are effectively criminalized as they are by law implicated in criminal activity. Sex workers in Canada elsewhere face difficulty exiting from the industry, seeking protection from police, and finding other paid work with a criminal record. Certainly, a criminal record very often impedes their transition to other forms of paid employment. And during the pandemic, some clients have tried to bargain down prices or demand riskier services such as sex without a condom for the same amount of money or at a discount. And then thirdly, decriminalization has been defined by activists as the first step towards sex workers' rights. New Zealand was the first nation to decriminalize sex work entirely in 2003. And since then, there are only 2 other jurisdictions in the world that have followed. They are both states in Australia, New South Wales, and Queensland. I wanted to profile here the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective. For decades, they worked with multiple state ministries and stakeholders to achieve decriminalization of sex work in 2003. They formed in 1987. Here they're celebrating their 30th anniversary. And they've done just absolutely exceptional work, and they're a leader globally in terms of sex workers' rights and sovereignty. So can we identify commonplace assumptions about sex workers, who they are, and what they do? Well, this leads us to a discussion of stigmatization. Negative stereotypes, horrorphobic stereotypes of sex workers include vectors of disease, home wreckers, oversex sluts, unmarriageable, traffic victims, unfit parents, moral deviants. We could add dangerous and disorderly. In the media, sex workers tend to be glamorized as high-end, high-earning hustlers, or maligned as devious gold diggers, or portrayed as victims of violence, trauma, and coercion. And all of this kind of hydra-headed stigma leads to sex workers being devalued and dehumanized in media and in society. As a result of stigma and criminal penalties, sex workers have experienced violence, police harassment, loss of homes, barriers to renting a home, and state apprehension of children. Those most vulnerable to marginalization have been and continue to be trans, disabled, street-based, indigenous, Black, and people of color, or POC. Street-based sex workers have been subjected to the discourse and practices of disposability, marked for death. So I encourage us to consider the disappearance and murder, the genocide of countless Indigenous girls and women, including street-based sex workers across Canada. These disappearances and murders became the focus of the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. The report was launched in the spring of 2019 with 231 calls for justice. And we might also consider the escalating number of grisly murders of trans women of color in the sex industry in the US and Canada over the last 5 years. When we consider sex workers as resilient agents, we learn that organizers fight whorephobia by forming a global sex workers' rights movement. Most nations around the world have grassroots sex worker-led organizations. They have support from Amnesty International, the World Health Organization, AIDS International, Human Rights Watch, UNAIDS, the global network of sex work projects, and others. All of these organizations support decriminalization and destigmatization of adult sex work. The operating principle of sex work activists is, quote, nothing about us without us. In other words, do not draw up policy or police reforms without the leadership of sex workers around the table. Certainly over the past 5 decades, we have lots of evidence of sex workers emerging as researchers, teachers, curators, poets, designers, writers, and public speakers who raise awareness, reframe debates, and lobby for legal, social, and moral reforms. I just wanted to profile a number of sex worker-led organizations that have global reach and representation. This also invites the question, what other organizations might we add to this list? I just want to profile 2. This is the annual Red Umbrella Sex Workers Protest in June. Here it is in Vancouver with XXX Sex Workers Solidarity Association leading the way. And then also the protesters gathering in New York to fight for the decriminalization of sex work in the spring of 2019. Decriminalize, destigmatize, and decarcerate people in the sex trade is one of the sets of messages on the placards. I also wanted to introduce the work of Melissa Chateauvert. She has written a book called Sex Workers Unite. In it, she states, quote, in the praxis of street corners, the reception rooms of massage parlors, and the living rooms of brothels, consciousness raising among sex workers about working conditions, tricks, cops, lovers, and families had been going on longer than the second wave women's movement. And then from Canadian, Toronto-based sex worker and activist, decorated, passionate, and determined sex work professional, Valerie Scott, gave a talk for the TED Talk series, Someone You Love Could Be a Sex Worker. In it, she says, sex workers have always had to fight. We fight for our safety, fight to have our voices be heard, fight for the right to choose our career and to carry out our jobs. We are fighters, end of quote. I wanted to introduce Butterfly. Among those most vulnerable to police, bad dates, income loss, insecure housing, and deportation are Asian and migrant sex workers. Here we have Butterfly, Toronto-based advocacy organization. Their poster foregrounds their focus on rights, not rescue. They're also not inclined to seek support from police due to stigmatization and criminalization. Moreover, in 2020, members of Butterfly also face a rise in anti-Asian and anti-Black racism, as well as myriad barriers to economic support during the COVID pandemic. And I'll return to this in part 3 of my module. Finally, back to the theme of sex workers' resilience, I want to introduce this collection called Hustling Verse, an anthology of sex workers' poetry, edited by Amber Dawn and Justin Ducharme, published in 2019, an excellent example of sex workers' creativity and artistry. And then also a pop-up, sex workers pop-up exhibition in Manhattan in February and March of 2020. And then finally, a slide that showcases 2 Canadian scholarly collections, Selling Sex, published in 2013, and Red Light Labor, published in 2018, to which amazing sex work activists, leaders, and researchers have contributed. In summary, alongside repression of sex workers' lives and voices across social institutions, sex workers have a long and rich history of rising up, sharing mutual aid, and fighting for substantive citizenship and sovereignty. In part 2 of my module, we will examine the history of sex work in Vancouver as a strategy for helping us comprehend what has changed and what has stayed the same in the business. What are the continuities and discontinuities in the socio-legal and moral regulation of sex work and in sex workers' resilience to push back against oppression? Thank you very much.